back to Still Unbelievable. This week, you have three people with you. I'm Andrew Knight, and with me is Matthew Taylor and Dr. Brian Blais. Our topic this week is Justin Brierley's book, Unbelievable. But before we get to that, let me tell you a little bit about our guest. Dr. Blais is a professor of science at Bryant University, and he's also research professor at the Institute for Brain and Neural Systems at Brown University. Dr. Blais received his PhD in physics from Brown University and his master's in science from Brown. He received his bachelor's from Wesleyan University. Dr. Blais is a member of the National Association of Physics Teachers. He is a member of the Geological Society, and he is a member of the American Statistical Association. In 2001, Dr. Blais received a biomedical research grant. In 2006, Dr. Blais received a 3-year grant from the National Science Foundation for collaborative research in computational neuroscience. Brian, hello, and welcome to Still Unbelievable.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me.
Hi, Brian. Welcome.
Also with us is Matthew Taylor, who is the usual host over at Ask an Atheist Anything. Matthew, how you doing?
I'm fine. Good day, you all.
Brian, thanks for joining us. And as I said in the run-up a couple of seconds ago, we're going to be discussing Justin Brierley's book, Unbelievable. Tell us what got you interested specifically in writing the blog post that you did as a review of Justin's book.
Well, I've been listening to the Unbelievable podcast for many years. I would like to hear a little bit of my kind of background with religion first, which may provide some context for this.
Yes, please.
Okay. So I grew up in a Catholic household. I was even an altar boy, and I kind of broke away from the church in high school, started having kind of my doubts. In college, I would say that I kind of went back and I was a bit more of a deist at that, for a while. And then later in college, I think was the first time I would have called myself an atheist. But I've always been interested in how to think rationally. I mean, my background in science, a lot of things that I teach is kind of how to think like a scientist, how to think rationally. I like the kind of puzzle aspect of science where you're trying to have multiple models of things that you observe and try to figure out how can we figure out which ones are more probable or which one should we believe. And religion always talks about the big questions like, where did we come from? Where are we going? How should we live? But I always felt that these answers were, somewhat lacking in kind of substance. And there are a lot of kind of logical errors and science errors that come in. So I've been listening to the podcast, the Unbelievable podcast, for many years. And I like the debate format because it really helps bring out what the relevant issues are. And I think it's one of the nice things about it is that it's very pleasant as a podcast. Justin Brierley does a great job of moderating and smoothing things out, but really exploring and not dumbing things down. And so I've really enjoyed that part. And so I started a number of years ago on my blog to have direct responses to particular episodes. I mean, I had a lofty goal at one point of responding to every single episode, but I did many of them, but it got overwhelming. And then when Justin Brierley came out with his book, I was going to read it at some point, and I posted some response, I believe, it might have been Justin Brierley's his DICE video or. And he contacted me actually, and so I chatted with him a little bit, and he sent me a copy of the book to read, and so I read it and wrote the review for so that I could feel that it had a reasonable response to things. So I like the approach of the book, just like the podcast. It's in many ways it's trying to say we should have more reasonable discussion about these topics. And so I like that part of it, but obviously I disagree with many of his conclusions and many of his arguments, although he does, I think, summarize many of the standard apologetic arguments reasonably clearly for kind of a non-technical audience.
He does. You said that Justin's a good host and he's even-handed. I think you know that a group of us set out to respond to Unbelievable, and we wrote a book called Still Unbelievable. It's sort of the namesake for this podcast.
Yes.
And Justin was equally even-handed with us. He actually sent us copies of his book before it went to press, with the obvious restriction that we not let the books get away or copy them, sell
Right.
them or whatever, right? But all of that just to agree with you that Justin is a very even-handed and very open-minded host for Unbelievable, and he is equally even-handed in the dealings that the public does not see. So he's a good guy. In fact, Matthew Taylor wrote Chapter 1 in Still Unbelievable. So we're fortunate to have him. They didn't let me participate until somewhere down around Chapter 11 or something. I remember correctly.
I think I need to jump in here and say the chapters that we got aren't any kind of hierarchy. Let me just state that.
Yeah, okay. Well, they still didn't let me participate until Chapter 11.
I did make the effort to go to the Unbelievable conference in which Justin launched his book, and I have got a signed copy of the book, which Justin signed in front of me, which was an experience anyway.
So, Brian, I would actually like to go to the Unbelievable conference at some point just to see what it's all about. But Brian, when you were a Christian, when you moved from Christian to deist and from deist ultimately to atheism, tell me a little bit about that exit for you, because for me the problem was that the mindset that I used for Christianity was not the same mindset that I used to study computer science in college. And ultimately, I couldn't hold both of those worldviews. They didn't seem compatible to me. And I know that there are people who are much more accomplished than I am who maintain Christianity along with a commitment to science. But ultimately, I couldn't maintain that commitment, and I'm wondering what your journey out was.
To be fair, I think part of my journey out was typical teenage rebellion against my family at that time. When I was a freshman in high school, and so part of it was that, I think. But I think that what kind of pushed me over, really just learning a lot more about science as an undergraduate. I had a physics major, and so you learn a lot about science that way. And then I had a friend who was, I believe she was a chemistry major or something, and then she converted to a really conservative Christian religion, and it surprised me so I started arguing with her and some other friends I had around, and there was a kind of a Christian fellowship that was on campus, and I found that and a lot of this really conservative Christian stuff is pretty anti-science. So there, it's pretty clear that you cannot hold a really conservative Christian perspective and a science perspective. And these Christians were like anti-evolution, for example, and so on. And so these are. So I found myself kind of discussing a lot of these topics and things with them, and the conflicts with science, and mostly I started to recognize that people use a different way of thinking when they think about religious topics, where they're much less skeptical, perhaps is a good way to say, of their religious ideas than they would be in other contexts. And just trying to maintain skepticism across all contexts, I think, is really important. That's how it grew out of things. It's kind of my knowledge of science and really the approaches of that contrast with the way that most people think, it seems, about the religion.
I had a similar set of experiences in the religious group that I was a part of. We were, I mentioned this before, but it almost makes me cringe every time. We were young Earth creationists, and there was a real dislike of certain avenues of science, evolution being key among them, right? It wasn't just evolution.
Right.
If you sit down to study astronomy, you
Right.
can't honestly hold to a universe that's 6,000 years old.
Right. Yeah, you just can't.
It's not compatible. I think
Right.
M87 this week, right? You can't honestly hold the view that the first pictures of a black hole are tens of millions of light years away. I don't remember the exact number, 50 some odd million light years away, if I remember.
Right.
And you can't honestly accept that fact.
Right. Well, I guess, I mean, the common response there, I think, has been that God made the universe look old. So, for instance, if you saw Adam after one day, he wouldn't look like a 1 day old. He would look like a 30-year-old or whatever. And so, the universe would look old. But I mean, that is about the biggest conspiracy theory that you could perhaps ever propose, because it's pretty much every observation that you have is, somehow crafted in a way to make everything look really old. And then you can't tell the difference between that and the universe was created 10 minutes ago.
That's right. So there is the appearance of age argument, but it always seemed to me that there was we were on the horns of a dilemma there, because you were still being asked to pick what you would trust, right? Would you trust the instrumentation that gives the apparent age that it gives, right? The Earth being a little over 4 billion years old, and the universe being close to 14 billion years. Would you trust that instrumentation, or would you trust a creator who just gave it the appearance of age? And it seemed to be a real dilemma for me then. Mm-hmm. And if I were to go back at some point in the future, for some reason that I honestly can't imagine, right, that would still be a thing that would be of constant concern.
Right.
Why would I trust a God who gave this appearance of age? It might be that there's a good reason, but it's hard to understand what that would be when the simpler explanation is the instrumentation is.
Yes.
Yeah, that was, I remember that being an issue for me. I was here in the UK, we have a regular annual conference around about Easter time called Spring Harvest. It's been going on for a number of decades. I don't know if you guys have something similar your side of the pond. But I remember being at one many years ago, and someone was talking. The guy at the front was talking about this kind of issue, and he posed a question, which was one of the key moments I think in my own journey. And he said, "If Adam cut down a tree in the Garden of Eden, would it have had rings on it?" And that was one of the things that struck me as I walked away. And I remember thinking, well, if it did, that makes God a trickster God, which is the same as lying, which is deceitful. And I kind of went down those steps and I thought, I can't accept that the God that I love and worship is that kind of God. Right. So either Adam's tree would not have had rings, or that whole story is wrong. And it really hinged on that kind of seesaw. And I think that was one of multiple moments I had that took me down the pathway, because like Andrew, I was indoctrinated into young earth creationism as a young child, and I had to reject that as an adult. But I needed many moments like that in order to get me out. And I always say to people when asked, it was science that rescued me, because I had this belief of a young Earth in a young universe, and the realization that a young Earth was untenable, and therefore also a young universe was also untenable, because we've got redshift in light, which shows us that a universe is billions of years old. So it's the same as the tree ring problem in Adam, but it's much bigger. But it's exactly the same problem.
It is.
Did God trick everybody, or is it really this age. And I think it was a culmination of all these bits of evidence which got me out. So I think the question I'd like to ask you, Brian, because you said something about science rescuing you, I think. And if I understand right, you were more of a Catholic tradition than the Protestant young Earth creation tradition that Andrew and I came in. So I'm this is ground for me to be educated because I don't know a massive amount about the details of Catholicism, but you don't get young Earth in Catholicism. Isn't Catholicism much more friendly to an old Earth, to evolution, to
It is, yep.
into years? And all that? So, because one of the things that I struggle with is regularly, I sometimes think that if I'd been a much more liberal Christian, I'd still be a Christian.
Right.
So how does that reflect to you in your journey?
Well, I mean, so it is true that the Catholics tend to be a lot more liberal with these things. They tend to be a lot more pro-science. And I've had and I don't know whether anyone else has this opinion, and so this might be totally off base, but well, we know that in Judaism, you can call yourself a Jew and be an atheist. Like there within the culture, it's generally accepted that you could be a Jewish atheist, someone who likes the traditions, likes the community, and all the things that go with the holidays, everything that goes along with it, and yet doesn't buy into the supernatural aspects or the God or any of that. And within the Jewish tradition, I think it's actually relatively accepted. I mean, obviously you have the conservative Jews as well, but I think, and this is just from kind of observations over time, I think that there are a lot of Catholic atheists. And what this means is people who kind of grew up in the Catholic Church, who like the traditions and the holidays and the community, but don't really think a whole lot about the specifics of the belief in God or not. And they would never use that term, perhaps, and so it's not as accepted. But I think it has the same kind of roots in a way, because the Catholic Church is it's very large, so it has a pretty diverse, but it is much more open to science than obviously a lot of the conservative, Protestant traditions. So I was never, confronted really with a kind of young Earth interpretations or any of that stuff really until college, and then running into the kind of conservative wing of the Christian Fellowship.
That may lead us into our first real point of this conversation, which is Big Bang cosmology.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big claims in Justin's book that goes along with contemporary apologetics is that the universe had a beginning that necessarily implies a creator God.
Right.
And I wonder, Brian, because this really is your area of specialization to some extent, this is sort of part and parcel of modern physics to understand. I'm not making a claim that you're an astronomer or a cosmologist, but you are a physicist. And I'd like to know how you, as a physicist, square what we know of the beginning of the universe with a naturalistic view of creation. Sorry, it's almost the wrong word, right? But with the emergence of the universe as we know it versus the creator God.
So I'm not a cosmologist, but I can follow the arguments. And I think some of the clearest exposition of this comes from Sean Carroll, who is a cosmologist, and he had a fairly lengthy debate with William Lane Craig specifically about this, and the standard argument talks about the universe having a beginning, and it needs to have a cause and so forth. And what Sean Carroll kept saying is physicists and cosmologists, they don't speak about these kind of transcendent causes. They talk about models and whether your model predicts certain things or not. So you can have models of the origin of the universe. Some of them might be finite, meaning they have a beginning. Some of them might be infinite, where they don't have a beginning, but you may get the appearance of the kind of expansion. you can have multiverse models and so forth. And these models will then make various predictions that you can test against observations. You can test against, how smooth the radiation background is. You can look for correlations in radiation. You can look at the ratios of various elements, like the hydrogen to the helium, and different models may predict different things. And so that's how you can figure out which models are correct. And at no point do you refer to transcendent beginnings. And what I like to do whenever someone gives an argument for something is I try to go back to the original data wherever possible. So, for example, William Lane Craig loves to bring out the Borden-Guth-Vilenkin theorem to say that the universe must have had a beginning. And if you then go look at what the theorem says, you notice that it doesn't actually say that. It says that the expansion had a beginning at some point. And so there could have been things before the expansion, but we can't observe before that. And it also assumes classical physics, which we know to be incorrect in some cases and probably incorrect in Origin of Universe. And Sean Carroll does describe this. So when I start seeing arguments that hinge on things that have to be true for the argument to work, but they don't seem to be true, then I call it into question, and that makes a lot of the argument kind of collapse in many ways. I mean, all you really need is essentially a multiverse model to be true, any of them, and suddenly the whole our universe having a beginning can't really infer anything back before that in terms of much of it in terms of a cause anyway.
I've called that the gap of the outside fallacy, for lack of a better word, because if at some point, I know there are, I'm not conversant in discussing each of them, but I know there are a number of multiverse models. And if one of them were absolutely proven correct today, in the way that we would accept any science fact,
right,
what would come out in the next unbelievable would be, okay, right, but there has to be a God that created the multiverse, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so we can always posit a God that is outside of any container that we're in, right? There's this gap of the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the past, we had a God that was very, very big, right? He was above the heavens, and somehow he held the earth in his hands, right? He sat on the sphere of the earth. And then we had a God that was very, very small and might be tinkering around in the quantum world. And as we slowly untangled the quantum world, that gap closed. And now there's this gap of the outside, and I don't honestly know how we will ever close that off.
Well, I think you can always posit something like that, but it doesn't have any more explanatory power than saying magic did it.
Right.
Yeah.
So it sounds to me...
You go, Andrew, you go.
Oh, sorry. So one of the points that I've tried to get across in other shows and other episodes is that when we rewind the universe to whatever its original singularity was, and whatever rules govern that existence, we're not rewinding to nothing. We're rewinding to some state that, while we can't describe it, there was some state there. Whether it was just a field with no excitation, right, or whatever was going on there, it wasn't the nothing that the Christians claim from ex nihilo, right? The something from nothing,
right?
And so, as a physicist, you're okay with that. So there's not a problem with saying that whatever that rewinding does, if we could rewind the universe, we wouldn't rewind ultimately to nothing.
Right. Well, I mean, so I've written a number of things where I'm somewhat disdainful of a lot of philosophy, and there's arguments about that, and people will say like, well, as a scientist, you're using philosophy all the time, but this idea of coming to truth simply through language without observation, I have a problem with. And so something like the concept of nothing, I'm not convinced that you could have nothing. And so I feel like there is likely to have always been something, whether it's something really simple, it goes on infinitely, or whatever the source of that. And I think the only thing we can possibly do is look for models. Can we make a self-consistent model that begins with the fewest assumptions and the smallest amount of stuff in a way that will produce something like a universe like we have? And that's as good as we're ever going to get. But I don't think even in the Bible it says that God created things out of nothing. There was the waters, and he moved over the waters, and so I mean, obviously people will disagree and kind of how in the reading of it and so on. But I don't think the term ex nihilo comes at all in anything biblical. That seems to have come kind of later with the philosophers trying to grapple with this idea of God.
Matthew, you were going to say something a moment ago.
It was along the similar lines. It was about the beginning, but I'll follow on with the conversation. I'll side with Brian about philosophy. I think philosophy has got great advantages. It gives us questions that we can seek to try and answer. But I think it's one of the issues that I have when we try to get down into these details with believers is there does seem to be a trend in that some people think that philosophy can also answer these questions as well. And I don't think philosophy gives us the answers. It gives us some really interesting questions and some really challenging questions. But in order to answer the questions, we need something tangible, something that we can work with. And I think that's where science needs to step up the plate. When people worship philosophy and don't let science do its job, then they're not actually answering the question. They're just asking more questions. So where was I going with this? I've lost myself now with that. I was just enjoying philosophy bashing because it's something that I enjoy.
One way to think of it, Matthew, I think, is to think of like philosophy is science without the data. So it's what you can do before you can actually observe. So you can bring up good questions. You can draw out certain consequences and say, like, if this were true, then that would also be true, right? And those structures. But you could never demonstrate something exists with a philosophical argument, because you need data, you need observation in order to do that. And I did do put out a challenge to anyone to say, is there anything at all that we use a purely philosophical argument to establish the existence of a object, thing, person, mind, whatever? And I don't see any examples of that. And another game I like to do, and this goes on to kind of evidence and so on, is kind of the best evidence Google game. So what you do is on Google, you go like best evidence for, and you put in whatever you want to. So you put in like evolution, right? And you'll pull up like the Talk Origins website, and you'll get this like pages long, these observations demonstrate evolution. Or you say best evidence for the Big Bang, and you'll pull up cosmology sites and so on. And then if you do best evidence for God, what you generally get is these philosophical arguments, like Kalam or something like that, something that's just devoid of data and really is just not at even the standard that we would have for other things. And even things that we can't observe directly. So it's not an excuse that he's like, oh, you can't observe God directly. Well, you can't really observe the Big Bang directly. And evolution happens over such a long period of time. You do have to infer it from, various observations. So it's just, you can see a really different standard in the level of evidence and the types of things used to support these beliefs.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because I remember listening to various podcasts early in the days of questioning my Christianity, And so the podcasts that I was listening to were quite evenly split. Some were sciencey and some were very definitely religious. And I remember there was one of my favorite podcasts, which I've listened to since those early days, is Astronomy Cast, which is, as the name suggests, all about astronomy. And I remember listening to them talking about the science, about how we know what we know, I think is one of their taglines. And it was fascinating. I was really sucked into it. And then I went and listened to a couple of people talking who were young Earth creationists, and they were talking about the distance from the Earth to the Moon. And they're saying, well, clearly the universe can't be billions of years old, because if you calculate the rate at which the Moon is receding from the Earth and then calculate that back, that doesn't reach these billions of years. So clearly something's wrong. And then they moved on. And I remember sitting there thinking, they haven't really explained anything, have they? They haven't gone to any of the theories of how the moon formed. They haven't gone to any of the theories of, they haven't explained anything about why the moon is receding, and they haven't asked or even attempted to answer the question of, could that rate have changed or what started it? They've just gone and calculated and gone, well, X number of millions of years ago it would have been touching the Earth, and clearly that couldn't have happened. And I think that was a key moment for me. I thought, actually, they're not actually answering anything. They're just taking bits of what science has said, applying it to their philosophy, and they're ending up with bunkum. And it's not a surprise that they've ended up with bunkum, but they've assumed that their bunkum disproves the science.
Right.
And that was one of many. I've got many key moments which taught me out, and this was just another one of those stepping stones when I realized that actually I understood the science podcast and what it was explaining, and how we know what we know and what we don't know, and why we're trying to find out more about what we don't know and explain those. And it was very technical, but I could comprehend that. And when these guys who were young Earth creationists were trying to critique science from their young Earth creationist position, and they utterly failed whatsoever to explain the science, and it was that real, and that was just one of many steps. But anyway, I've remembered what it was that I was going to say before, and we were talking about the Big Bang and the start, and the Big Bang being the start of the universe in the form that it is now. And one of the things that is regularly mentioned, is talked about in terms of a God being the creator of the universe that we've got, is the universe has a beginning, therefore it must have started, therefore a God must have started it. And that's okay, I might have missed out a step there, but that's basically where it goes. But we all know full well that if the science had said something else, if the science actually said there was no beginning to the universe and the universe was static and it had been that way for infinity, we know full well that the religions would have found a way to explain that via God as well. And I think, again, that's one of the other stepping stones that I had, was every explanation somehow ends up with God. There is no explanation that can't end up with God. But the step from science to God is always philosophical, and it's never evidence-based. And that is, again, that is a key thing for me. And you mentioned something about arguments, Brian. I participate quite heavily on the closed Unbelievable Facebook group. It gets a little bit ugly at times, but I'm on there regularly. And the sentence that I type the most often in a reply on there is, arguments are not evidence. And it's almost become a mantra. And I sometimes I'll say it just because it needs to be said, because it was a key moment for me in my exit, that an argument is not evidence. Yes, arguments can use evidence, but arguments are not evidence. And it seems so often that whenever you ask somebody for evidence for God, you know full well that the answer you're going to get is an argument.
Yes.
So, Brian, one of the things Matthew is sort of talking about there is an argument from fine-tuning, right? That the Earth and the Moon have to coexist in a particular way, and our model of the universe, that what we can study seems to require that some God was tinkering with the gears at the outset, right? The moon,
Right.
if we just rewind our current cosmology without God, maybe the moon was touching the earth or whatever these guys on the podcast said, right? And
Right.
and so there's an important aspect of Justin's book that depends on fine tuning, and you talked about his
Yes.
dice video
Yes.
earlier. So tell us about your view on fine tuning from Justin's book.
Yeah. So, and again, the Sean Carroll covers this well, and he actually admits that this is kind of the best argument that the theists have, even though it's a terrible argument anyway. And there have been some recent observations in cosmology that suggest that some of the fundamental constants, speed of light, expansion rate of the universe, fine structure constant, and so on, are, if they were changed in very tiny ways, you would not get the universe like we would have. You might not get atoms, you might get total homogeneous universe, something like that. I mean, you'll just get something that's not conducive to life. And so the idea then is they have to be so finely tuned that these parameters have to be set in a certain way in order to get things like us. That this is an argument for an intelligent creator that would do that. There are a number of problems with this. And one of them is that not everyone agrees that there's actually a fine-tuning problem, but some of the fine-tunings that have been suggested have been shown later on to not be finely tuned. So, for example, the expansion rate of the universe, the initial calculation was done in kind of an approximate way, and you see the fine-tuning, but when someone redoes the calculation using general relativity, they find out that the value has to be exactly what we observe it to be, that there is no other constant that it could be. So it's essentially not an arbitrary constant, it's specified by the model, so it can't be changed. So there, and we don't know whether the constants in these models are changeable. They're just arbitrary right now because they're in the models. There's nothing external that's setting them, and they have the values that they have. But it's possible that many of these are consequences of other things.
So these fundamental constants are linked to each other.
Yes.
I see.
Or they, so they're either linked to some overall model, they can't be changed. They could be linked to each other, so you can't vary them individually. So if you change one, you have to change another one. So they're tied.
Mm-hmm.
And in those cases, we don't really know whether you could get different universes in that way, because just the number of possibilities are too much to calculate.
Mm-hmm.
So if you wiggle them one at a time, maybe you have a problem, but maybe you can't wiggle them one at a time. But we don't really know. I mean, again, this is one of those cases, and some cases, like more locally, some of the fine tunings, like in the solar system, like we have to have a moon large enough for certain things to happen, like tides, or we have to have a planet like Jupiter so that keeps the comets away. I mean,
Right.
People made various arguments for these, and in the ones that one can explore, we find that actually there's a lot more variety in the universe that we thought, and that the conditions for life are actually a lot more varied than we thought they were. And so what we used to consider to be what they call the Goldilocks zone, where the planet has to be in a certain spot, that's really expanded over time, when we realized that life doesn't have to be as fragile as people. It can be things like tardigrades, which can survive nearly anywhere. And so we get a lot of these sorts of ideas that you can either demonstrate that they're wrong where we understand it, or they're an area we don't really understand, and where it's at the kind of forefront of our understanding. And so when you have something like that, then you have to say, well, that's not particularly convincing, especially given that you're arguing for something that's supposed to be pervasive in the entire universe, and it's supposed to be acting on the Earth day to day, and yet the only evidence you're showing are from things that are really at the edge of our understanding and are pretty abstract for the most part.
So yeah, it's an interesting point you make, actually, because sometimes I get the impression from listening to the fine-tuning argument that the properties of the universe are treated somewhat like a game of Yahtzee, in that you throw the dice and they can all come up with any number, and there is no codependency between any of those. And I'm increasingly getting the impression that that is not even remotely true. And so it does seem that the fine-tuning argument isn't actually based on a solid foundation at all anyway.
Right. It really isn't.
One of the tricks that I thought Justin played that is, and I don't want to be so unkind as to call it a trick, but it really felt that way. There's a sort of publishing trick in modern apologetics to take some small fundamental constant and write it out as as some exponent of 1 times 10 to the minus 60 or whatever, right?
Right. Yes.
And the problem that I have with that is that it can be somewhat like measuring Matthew's height in light years, right?
Sure.
We don't do that kind of thing because the scale is wrong.
Sure. Right.
And so when we talk about changing a fundamental constant, it may not be meaningful to say that some fundamental constant that is some base times 10 to minus 60 or whatever, it may not be sensible to talk about it as some base times 10 to minus 30 or whatever. We're talking about 30 orders of magnitude of change. And so I'm not sure that's not just trying to astonish someone just by making it a wow number, right?
Well, actually, I think to be fair, I think he's actually using it correctly, because he's not. The numbers he's showing are not things that are in a particular unit. He's saying if you were to change this constant, let's say it's the speed of light, for example, right? And we call that, let's say we call it 1, just for, in whatever units, right? So it's 1. Then you can't change it in 1 part in 10 to the 30, right? So then you'd have to go out 30 decimal places to change it. And if you even change way out there, it would break the universe. And so I think it does, if that is true, if that fact is true, that the speed of light cannot be changed by even that tiny amount, but it could be changed. Right? We don't know even whether these constants are actually changeable,
right?
And that you could change it alone, meaning that like you could change it and not change anything else. And those are all really huge ifs, right? And those are probably not true. But if that's the case, then the argument is actually reasonable, because it would say that it's because it's thinking of it like a percentage, right? How much of a percent change. So it's not really a scale in the same way as saying, Matthew's height in light years, where you could just change the scale and the number would change. Here, you could change the scale, but since you're dealing with a percent change, you're not going to change the value. And you do, in a sense, want to, if the argument is true, impress upon people like how tiny of a change would this be, right? And I think that's I think that's reasonable. It's just that we don't know whether we can actually change these, whether not we as in people, but whether it is even physically permissible, whether they could be any different, whether they're specified by some other thing, or whether they are independent. I mean, they're often stated as by apologists as there are these arbitrary constants in the models, but we don't really know they're arbitrary. They're arbitrary in the models in the sense that they're not specified by the model. They're just a value that is in the model, and it's not the value we just know empirically, right? And so, but there could be some Uber model, some model that describes that one, where it becomes a consequence of that.
Sure.
And we just don't know whether that's the case or not.
It's interesting that you picked on the speed of light actually in that example, because the first thing that jumped into my head was E equals mc squared. So if you change the speed of light, you change the mass of every physical object in the universe. And if you change the mass of every object in the universe, you're then changing its gravitational attraction.
Right.
And so suddenly you've got this cascade of dominoes. And if you're changing the gravity of everything, you're then changing the limit of a black hole. and then you're then
Right.
changing the way a universe orbits.
Right.
You're changing
Sure.
the way
Right.
planets orbit their star, and so many things have changed because you've
Right.
changed the speed of light. And suddenly there we have in that example, the demonstration that actually these numbers are not arbitrary. They are all interdependent. They all are related in one way or another. And just arbitrarily changing one isn't a freedom that you have because you change absolutely everything else.
Sure. I mean, well, I guess the argument is that if you change even one thing a tiny amount, you're going to impact kind of the entire structure of the universe, right? And you'll have really different consequences. But for example, maybe you change the speed of light, but if you were to increase the speed of light, you'd have to, but the only physical permitted universes would have, say, a smaller gravitational constant, right? That's another different constant, right? That would have it. So you might get things that end up balancing out, or they might produce a universe that has properties that could generate life, but we just, wouldn't be able to derive that, right? Because it's just too complicated. You simply don't know, and we don't know, as Sean Carroll says, we don't know the conditions under which life could form. And so we're at a loss there as well. So it's possible that you could change the constants by small amounts. We get a really different universe. We get life in a very different way. That's possible too. We just simply don't know.
One of the arguments that I've seen used is taken from a quote, I believe, which is from Stephen Hawking, where he talks about the expansion of the universe, where if it was a little bit too much, the universe would have expanded too fast and nothing would have been able to form. And if it expanded not quite fast enough, it would have recollapsed back into a singularity. Is that statement still considered to be true? And is that still a good argument for Christians to use?
So, okay. So yes and no. So yes, it is true. But the thing is that you can derive the correct expansion rate for the universe using general relativity and show that it is not free to move. It is perfectly specified, and it is the value that we observe. So it's one of these things where the first calculation you do, which is the easier one to do, seems to indicate a fine tuning. But then when you do it kind of properly with the best models that we have, the fine tuning disappears. And so it is true that if it were larger, then we'd have this problem, or if it were smaller, we would have this problem. It can't be.
Okay.
So it's no longer a good argument. It's basically the point. And then that's true for a few of the other proposed fine tunings that have happened and that people have proposed.
Now, how do our listeners become familiar with what you've just said? Is there a good resource that we can point them to understand what you've just laid out?
I really like Sean Carroll's work, and he also has a podcast as well that's somewhat recent. But his debate with William Lane Craig, I think, is really a model of how to respond to these things. Because in many cases, he would say to Craig that, you're just using the wrong words. It's kind of like holding up he said, this is an analogy Sean Carroll used. It's like holding up the iPhone and saying, where does the film go? Right? It just, and it's like, if you're just using the wrong vocabulary to even describe things. And so it's at that level of fundamental level. And he also pointed out things like, William Lane Craig's favorite theorem he loves to tout out, that Borden-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, which says that the universe had a beginning. Sean Carroll brought out Guth is saying, no, I don't think the universe had a beginning. And so one of the authors of the theorem saying that he doesn't think it implies that the universe had a beginning, and that he doesn't think that there was a beginning. So doing those sorts of things, I think, is really helpful, because even if you can't follow all the methodology, you got to think something is amiss when you are hearing an argument using like a mathematical theorem that's named, and one of the authors disagrees with the conclusion that you're raising. And that by itself should make you wonder about how much you should trust that argument and so on.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, actually, because Phil, one of the other authors of our Still Unbelievable book, he has a YouTube channel, Skydive Phil, where he does a few cosmology related videos. He brought out the video of the person you're mentioning and showing he's next to a blackboard with equations on it, and he's explaining, saying the universe could be past infinite. And I've used exactly that argument against people saying, oh, the B of BGV says that the universe has a start, therefore God. And I've said, actually, the G of BGV actually says that the universe could be past infinite. And that's actually quite an effective method of closing down that argument. So I've not had a comeback from that. But I'd like to rewind back to a little bit what you said about the numbers of the universe. So a question for my own clarification, but hopefully it will be useful for listeners, is pi. Pi is an interesting number in itself. But if I get a circle, it doesn't matter how big that circle is, and I divide the circumference by the radius, I get a number that approximates pi. Mm-hmm. And there is no circle that I can draw that does not result in the same number. Is that kind of what you're saying about the numbers that make up the fine-tuning universe? Is it fair to say that they're like pi? It's just not possible for those numbers to be anything other than what they are.
Yeah, that's a reasonable analogy. Although, unfortunately, with pi, it depends on geometry, right? And so you can get, if you draw certain, depending on how you're
going to draw a circle on a sphere now, aren't you? Just
yes,
exactly. To make it awkward.
Right.
Okay.
Well, I mean, you're defining, kind of equidistant, and once you kind of get on a large scale, you can get kind of strange things going on there. But that's actually how they can test whether the universe is flat or curved on the large scales, is by essentially adding up the angles and triangles on a large scale, and you can get at some of the geometry, even though you're kind of inside it. So we can tell, for example, that we're on the curved Earth without leaving the Earth by adding up the angles of triangles, and notice that they don't add up to 180 degrees. You can have a triangle with 3 right angles in it, and because you could have, essentially on the Earth, you could have a curve that's on the equator, and then you could have 2 longitude lines that leave at 90 degrees that go up to the poles at 90 degrees, and so you could have obviously from the outside of the sphere, you can see it's the lines are bent, right? They're curved. But even if you were constrained to be on the surface, you can determine that you're on a curved surface. And that's how general relativity works in terms of a description. You can describe space-time, even though you're kind of embedded in it. You can describe the geometry, and you can do things like, by knowing that light travels in straight lines in this geometry, you can add up angles and triangles and so on, and determine where the space is curved or whether it's flat on the largest scales and so on.
I'm saying yes, like I understand. No, I do understand that, because the triangle with 3 right angles is a conversation that I've had with my daughter, because I think that's actually very cool, drawing a triangle on a globe. It's quite funky, because you say to someone, I can draw a triangle with 3 right angles. They go, you can't.
Yeah.
And then you pull out the triangle. So yeah, I understand the point. Thank you.
So that actually sort of leads us into another claim of Justin's book, if only a little tangentially, and that has to do with the fundamental nature of whether our universe is open or closed, and the second law of thermodynamics. So Justin he talks a little bit in his book about his dad. His dad was apparently a chemist and a gardener, and there's a bit of a discussion early on about the claim of, I think, sort of crudely stated, the second law of thermodynamics is things tend toward a state of disorder. At least that's what Justin's dad is driving at, right? Is that if he leaves his garden and he doesn't do any gardening for weeks or months or years, he comes back, the garden is in a state of disorder. And he appeals to the second law of thermodynamics to say, but there must be a creator, because systems left to themselves tend to disorder, and it must have taken an intelligent mind to order the universe. And so I'm wondering, Brian, what you think about that idea.
That particular idea has kind of leaves a bad taste in my mouth in a way, because it goes back to college when I was arguing with various people, and it's often actually put out as the evidence against life forming on the Earth, that life is an orderly structure and that you would need some kind of external agent in order to create that order, given the second law. So basically saying that evolution is in conflict with the second law of thermodynamics. And being a kind of a new physics major, I was like, oh yeah, I know the answer to this one, because you learn it in kind of physics 101, and that is that the second law applies to closed systems, and the Earth, for example, is not a closed system. So in terms of origin of life or any of those, you would have that. I mean, and the analogy that I like to use is to say, well, if you're going to say that every decrease in entropy requires an agent, then you're going to have God freezing every single pond every winter, because going from liquid state to solid state is a decrease in entropy.
Mm.
And so you can obviously have localized decreases in entropy that happen, and that happens on every scale. And so it is true that planets are more organized than scattered atoms, but you have to, if you look at the universe as a whole, then you should see that the entropy is increasing over time, even though locally you're going to get small patches of order, like planets and galaxies and things like that, because of gravity. Obviously, it gets a little messier once you start getting the expansion of the universe and so on. But it's a bad argument, because the systems that are pointing to that seem to require an agent, none of them are closed systems. Or if they are closed systems, you're talking about a small part of a closed system, and there's no violation of the second law having localized decreases in entropy as long as the overall entropy goes up. So it's a bad argument all the ways around, and it keeps coming back for whatever reason. And I just find it astonishing that someone would think that the second law of thermodynamics, which is one of our most confident in, is in conflict with the theory of evolution, of which we're also really confident in, and no scientists happen to notice a glaring contradiction. I mean, it just seems that seems a little ridiculous.
It also seemed to me, I thought gardening was not a particularly good way to teach that lesson, because what we know, maybe this was not true in Justin's formative years, and maybe we didn't have quite the same knowledge of natural systems that we do now, but it is not the case that, so think if you leave a garden, maybe it becomes a forest, right? Or maybe it becomes a rainforest or a tropical forest or whatever, or a jungle. But it is not the case that a jungle is disordered. Right. While we don't necessarily see right angles or whatever we expect to see in order, a jungle is not ordered in the same way that we would build a house or a car or whatever, right? It is not the case that those systems are disordered in the sense that I took Justin to be relating his dad's understanding of the second law of thermodynamics.
Right.
And so for those who have read that idea, I don't think that was a clear understanding of the second law, and now
right.
Hopefully our listeners aren't quite taken in by that now.
Right. I mean, and I think of it in terms of order and disorder. I think it can run you into problems. Perhaps a slightly better way to think of it in terms of concentration of energy. So energy tends to smear out, kind of smooth out over time. And that's an increase in entropy. When it's more concentrated in one spot, then that would be a decrease. And so you can think of things like going from liquid to solid. You can think of things going from non-life to life. You can think of a lot of things that, depending on how you want to call order and disorder, it's just better to think of it as energy being concentrated, fewer ways to reorganize it.
Mm. Matthew, do you have any thoughts there?
Only very simple. I mean, the obvious thing that occurs to me about a garden is receives tons of energy from the great big ball of fire in the sky.
Sure.
So it's not really a good analogy for a closed system, because it's receiving stacks and stacks of energy on a regular basis every 24 hours. So something is going to result from that, and it's not going to necessarily be increased disorder. There's going to be a fight among the plants for the receptacle of this energy, and whichever plant wins that fight for receiving the energy is going to dominate the garden. There's a clear relationship there. So I don't think it's a particularly good example. Well, it is a good example, but it just doesn't make the point that Justin was trying to make. It's a great example for evolution.
Yeah.
Okay. So, having talked about the beginning of the universe and fine-tuning, talked a great deal about cosmology, we can't leave behind the central claim of Christianity and the heart of Justin's book. We can't leave behind the Christian story, right? Because all of this builds toward Justin's claim that we can trust the Bible, and we can trust the history. We can trust the idea of the resurrection, and we should all, in the end, trust Christianity and the concept of salvation. And Brian, one of the things that we talked about a lot in the run-up to this show that the listeners didn't hear is about the history of Christianity, how we go about assessing claims of Christianity, and whether we can trust stories like the resurrection story. Maybe this is time to move into that territory. So you have done a lot of writing about something called Bayes' theorem, or Bayesian statistics. Our listeners will see this in the press quite often right now. Bayes is sort of a modern hot topic. And so maybe we can talk for a minute about how to take Bayes and apply it to claims like the resurrection story, and can we trust ideas like resurrection?
Right. So the term, Bayesian, it's kind of funny that you say that it's a modern hot topic, because the ideas go back to about 1700s with Laplace primarily, and I prefer just to refer to it as probability theory. So basically, just the mathematics around probability, and there are a certain set of kind of mathematical rules that you follow that would make probabilities behave in a way that is consistent with things like logic. So things like if something is either true or it's not true, right? So I can take a claim, either there is a God or there's not a God, right? And so probabilities for those have to add up to 1. And you can make a list of these rules, and there's actually a very small number of them that tell you how you should do the mathematics of probabilities. And essentially what it comes down to, and what Bayes' theorem is, that's the name for it, is this kind of balancing between, it's talking about probabilities for different explanations for what you're observing. So if you're looking at the world outside, you can get some data or evidence for things, and you have a number of competing models descriptions or explanations of that data. And the question is, which model or explanation should you trust? And what we like to do is we like to assign a number between 0 and 1, essentially, for how confident we are in these various models. 0 meaning I'm absolutely certain logically that it is false. 1 being I'm absolutely certain that it is true, and then all the various degrees of belief in between 0 and 1. And what Bayes' theorem does is it says, okay, your belief in an explanation should scale with how well that explanation explains the data. It should scale also by how likely that explanation would have been true before you even saw any data. That would be what's called the prior to the data. And it should be scaled down by essentially all of the alternative plausible explanations for that particular data. And so when you take something like the resurrection, you have to look at not just how well does the resurrection itself explain, various things you want to explain, the claims about visions or visitations by Jesus, the claims about women seeing the tomb, and so on. And you have to look at, okay, prior probability of a resurrection, which obviously is going to be quite low, and then and scaling things down based on plausible alternatives. And even many of the alternatives, which might seem far-fetched, are probably more likely than someone coming back from the dead. So even something as silly sounding as maybe Jesus had a twin, there's actually some biblical support for that, but it's pretty unlikely. But it's probably more likely than someone coming up out of the grave. And so one of the problems that you can run into, though, is, and unfortunately, once you start talking about math, is that you could easily cloud the issue with the mathematics as well, because probability theory is only as good as the assumptions you put into it. And it's very easy to make a very complicated looking equation that really isn't at all realistic or reasonable or anything else, but it takes effort to kind of pick it apart and see, where is it going wrong. And so when you talk about Bayes, you'll hear things like Richard Swinburne will calculate a 97% chance that the resurrection happened. You'll get Tim McGrew who'll say it's it has to be true within 1 part in 10 to the 40th or something like that. But then you also get Richard Carrier who will have it flipped on the other side, right? So again, it depends. You have to kind of pick apart the assumptions as it going in. But if you think in terms of just how well does your explanation fit the data? How plausible is it before the data? And what are all of the possible alternatives? It's a reasonable way to approach the problem.
I asked myself when I considered trying to use Bayes for something like the resurrection. Right? I think, if I'm being honest, I think that's sort of a false start for some reasons that maybe we'll get into in a minute, having to do with history being the wrong tool to try to prove a miracle, right? Mm. But I asked myself in regard to Bayes, what would the false positives and false negatives be, right? When you make a claim of a resurrection, what are the false positives that you would typically associate with, so if you're using Bayes to determine whether you're going to get a cold this season, or, do you have cancer? Particular type of cancer or whatever, right? When we do those types of tests, we need things like how often the test generates a false positive and how often the test generates a false negative. And that's where Bayes is really successful, right? Then we get to estimate. We started out and maybe we think we're 90% sure that we have cancer, but given this test's ability to produce false positives and false negatives, going through the equation, well, it's less likely then, right? Because tests can be wrong. And so I've asked myself, in regard to Bayes and trying to calculate the likelihood of the resurrection, what would we even talk about in regard to false positives and false negatives? How do we actually try to successfully apply Bayes? And as someone with a bachelor's degree in computer science, I'm not claiming a great depth of familiarity with Bayes or statistics. I'm not I'm not making any claims of expertise here, but I honestly, with my best effort, couldn't get traction with trying to apply Bayes in any meaningful way.
Right. So one of the things about the disease example is that it also often hinges on how common the disease is. So if you have a very rare disease, then the kind of false positive rate is going to mask out the true positive rate, but because there's, even though it's a small percentage chance, it's over a larger population. So you get these cases where you can show that a test for a rare disease, even if it's like 99%, even if the test is 99% successful, if you test positive, it's still like only like a 2% chance that you actually have the disease. I mean, you can show cases like that depending on how rare the disease is.
Right. Is that base rate neglect? Is that the right term?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And so in the case of things like the resurrection, you have to ask questions about, given the resurrection, what data would we think that we should observe, and given the data, and let's assume that there is no resurrection, what sorts of data would we observe? And so the apologists will often talk about how you can't explain the data with a naturalistic interpretation. And sometimes it's kind of disagreeing on what the data is, right? They'll say things like, you have to explain appearances to 500 people. Right, as an example, they'll quote the letters of Paul in that, right? And they'll say, oh, you can't possibly have multiple hallucinations, right? In that case. And the problem is we don't have visions from 500 people. We have one person making the claim that there were 500 people who saw the risen Jesus, and we have that author not corroborated by later authors, namely the Gospels, on that number or anything close to that. And so the data we have isn't what's being stated. It's that the data we have are claims about those things that are being stated. And that changes things, obviously. So is there any naturalistic way of explaining someone claiming that there were 500 people, having a vision? Absolutely. It's pretty easy to do that. We could possibly even explain 500 people claiming to have a vision, something like the visions at Fatima come to mind, where we have thousands of people claiming to have seen the sun dancing in the sky and so on. And this brings in actually a lot of things about the way people report stories and so on. There was an interesting article, I think it was in Skeptical Inquirer, that talked about someone doing interviews with people in the who were there at Fatima, and finding that most of them, when you asked them directly, told different stories about what they saw, and it was only after a while that the stories kind of converged to a single thing, like the sun dancing in the sky and so on. And we see the same thing with UFO sightings, where you'll have a bunch of people saying, yeah, we saw this UFO, we saw the spaceship and so on. But if you can go back to very close to the event, you find that they actually all saw somewhat different things, and that wouldn't have been consistent with a single sort of vision.
Right.
But it's only after a while, after things are being told, and it doesn't have to be very long, that everyone kind of converges to the same kind of story. And so these things happen. And this is one of the things why history is inherently less reliable than, say, physics, right? It's because we have direct access to physical systems, and we can test them. We don't have that kind of access for history. So there's only a certain level of confidence we can have in any historical claim. And that's where kind of probability comes in. And I wouldn't tend to advise having specific numbers for many of these things. And that's where you can run into problems and being like, well, what's the prior for a resurrection and so on. But you can look at the structure and you can do some comparisons. But, and another way to put it is to say, what if we translated all of the data we have for the resurrection to modern times? So what do we have? We have documents that were written 40 years afterward. about this guy who supposedly came back from the dead, right? If we had that now about Joe from 20 years ago, would anyone believe that claim? Would they believe it even if you had a bunch of followers of Joe, saying how amazing Joe was and he did all sorts of things? Would we believe any of these claims? And I think we find that when we evaluate evidence now, if we are buying a used car, if we're going to the doctor and they say you have a disease and so on, we expect a level of evidence to make us confident in these claims. And the more exotic the claims, we want better evidence. And everyone knows this. But somehow, if you translate it back to claims from texts from 2,000 years ago, somehow people are confident in these claims when they wouldn't be confident of the same things when they would actually be able to investigate it. And so this is where, if you just start thinking, using your imagination essentially to come up with alternatives and to be honest about what the data we actually have is, then we could then you can kind of get around the math. You're not really talking about math here. You're just looking at, how do we explain these things and what's the problem with the way that the apologists usually do it.
Yeah, it's there's another sort of similar phenomenon. We are better at crediting what another person might think than we are at crediting what God thinks. God almost always lines up. If you ask a person what God thinks about some idea, and whether it's good or bad, the God universally agrees with the person's predisposition, right? But we're
Right.
better at crediting. So if I said, my God thinks that eating Cheerios for breakfast is a sin, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would be better at crediting you, your own views, than I would at thinking that God might disagree with me, right? So God always lines up, my personal God always lines up with whatever I think is right or wrong. So in your view then, have you tried to use Bayes in regard to any particular biblical claim?
I would say mathematically, like numerically, probably not. I mean, it's easier to kind of call into question when someone is doing it to kind of bolster a particular claim. I'm not a big fan of doing these things numerically because, I mean, there really is just nothing to kind of pin it down on, and that's a lot of it has to do with the way the data is and the types of claims. But there are certain consequences from probability that one can look at. Like, for example, and I saw this actually on the forum, even I think today, even someone was talking about how the God description is a simple one because there's just one God and he doesn't have any parts and that sort of thing. And I know someone was calling the question whether you could really have a mind that doesn't have parts, but people often mistake simplicity for the number of parts. And that's not the way, and you can actually show mathematically that that's not how it plays out. So you can have a model that has a lot of parts to it that is in fact simpler than one that has fewer parts to it. And what it comes down to mostly is flexibility. So the more complicated model is more flexible. You have, in the mathematical terms, tunable parameters. The more ways that you can kind of explain things, kind of adjust the model. And so if you have something like a God that can do anything, it is in fact the opposite of simple because it is so adjustable to every single possible observation that it loses its content. And in fact, it has almost infinite complexity for that purpose, almost kind of mathematically. And so that's why in science, we prefer models that are specific, that make specific predictions ahead of time, that they aren't just always post hoc, like, oh yeah, I can explain that too, sorts of explanations. And so and I think that's a big mistake that is made in these arguments. And we can take various lessons from probability theory in spotting them, even in a non-mathematical setting.
It sounds to me, Brian, that you're saying that a process that can arbitrarily jump in and change what's going on isn't really basic. So let me start again. If you've got a scenario that should be normal and predictable, as soon as you introduce something that can arbitrarily change what's going on, you've disqualified that explanation from being applicable to Bayes.
Not quite. I would say that from the rules of probability, of which Bayes' theorem is a consequence, but I always think of just kind of probability theory in general. You can derive the case that when you should trust more complicated models and when you shouldn't. In philosophy, they call it Occam's razor, but there's a mathematical equivalent of that that's derived from probability. And it happens when you have models that have some flexibility to them. And so, for example, if I were to have a model of like a deck of cards that would predict, let's say, the first 10 cards, and I list out the 10 cards that are going to come out, and I say it explicitly, that's actually a pretty simple model. Whereas like one that I say, well, I'm going to get a spade or a red card on the first one, I'm going to get something greater than 5 on the second card, and so on. So that way, after the fact, almost like it'll be consistent with many different types of observations. That would actually be a more complicated model because you have these kind of flexibilities, and mathematically you can show that those models should be penalized by the level of flexibility they have. And so when you have something like the God hypothesis that says that God can pretty much do anything, then you're pretty much saying that no matter what happens, and we saw this, before when we were talking about like if the universe was shown to be infinite, then there would be a theistic argument for that. And so it's the same way. It's essentially not well defined but it's essentially overly plastic or overly flexible, and that's an indication of complexity, not simplicity.
So, in the case of a God, is there any hope for science to grapple with this idea of the plastic Christian God? Plastic meaning malleable, right? So,
right.
One of the problems that I think we face in the modern landscape in trying to pin Christianity down, right? We can always be accused of offering straw men against Christianity, right?
Uh-huh.
But we are always offering straw men against some version of Christianity, because even in the United States, there are a couple of thousand Christian denominations by conservative estimate.
Right.
And so it doesn't seem to me that in a world where we're trying to use science to model our best explanations, I'm not sure that science can ever actually grapple with some of the Christian claims. We can't really nail them down in any particular way. So, what do we do we give up? How do we bridge the gap to talk about science and Christianity together? Is that a sensible conversation? Are we tilting at windmills to try to use science in conjunction with Christianity? Are they overlapping magisteria? Are they separate magisteria?
Well, yeah. So the way I see it is that there are some God claims that are in principle untestable. So you take the basic deist claim that there was a creator of the universe, and then they checked out. They don't care about people. They just are, not interfering with the universe at all. We're pretty much alone at this point. There is no way, even in principle, of showing that to be false in any real way. But in that way, it also has no content. So I think the approach can be either a particular argument has content, in which case it should be testable, or it doesn't have content, in which case if it's not testable in that sense, then it just doesn't have content, and we shouldn't bother with it at all. But we should, so anyone believing that should be shown like, look, this essentially has no content to it. So if you take something like the Christian God, and I think Matt Dillahunty said actually there's a version of Christianity for every Christian. And so I think that's just pretty close. But you take some claims like, young Earth and so on, you can demonstrate those are false. Okay, so we've retreated from that. I mean, then liberal Christianity pretty much has been in a retreat mode for hundreds of years, since science has really offered better explanations on every single front. And then what you're left with is this kind of nebulous, content-free sort of situation. And maybe that's useful in some ways, but I don't see it as particularly useful. But I think from the science perspective, we can always hammer home the observations that actually conflict, and just leave people with content-free claims and point those out as like not having any content. When someone says something like, supernatural causation, there's no difference between that and saying that magic did it. Right. And it has the same level of explanatory power. You don't know anything more after saying supernatural thing caused it versus magic caused it. And that's one way to kind of show that there was no content for that. That's actually how I got out of deism, really, was that I recognized, like, wait a minute, all this stuff that I'm saying, there's just nothing there. And so that's how I marched it on there. So you could be a Christian and a scientist, but where Christianity talks about the real world, science will always have better answers. And where it doesn't talk about the real world, there's really no content there.
So I'd like to drill down on a word you used there for a second, and that word is cause, right? Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that the way Christianity uses the word cause and the way you used the word cause are potentially quite different. When you say cause, it sounds to me, and it's certainly the way I use cause, we're talking about something that can be identified. Well, typically we think of the universe in cause and effect mode, right? So we think of something that is identifiable that precedes some other thing, and they're necessarily linked by some set of attributes, right? And so I'm not even sure what Christians mean by cause in the way you use cause. So if we claim a creator God, right? God caused the universe. That whatever that cause is, whatever that mechanism is to create the universe, it seems to be forever a black box that we can't understand. And that is not quite the way I use the word cause. Cause is a more explicable mechanism. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what you think about that. Do you see it the same way?
Well, I mean, I think day to day we use the language of cause and effect, and it makes sense on every kind of day to day thing that we're dealing with. Once you start getting into things like quantum mechanics, Big Bang cosmology, the idea of causation stops being useful vocabulary, right. And you can have essentially uncaused events. So production pairs of particles and antiparticles is essentially uncaused. Radioactive decay, for example, is a process that's uncaused. And so what there you deal with models that make various predictions. So even things like, talking about causation without time is a little weird, but you can talk about models where you have a first moment in time, and you can have the descriptions of how time might work in various scenarios that has to be consistent with general relativity and so forth. So you have models that then would spin out predictions for things like the radiation distribution in the universe. But the problem with the statements by theists is that they'll say so you have to say something like, God caused the beginning of the universe. Okay. So that's a claim. That's not, evidence or whatever. And you can't even use the origin of the universe as evidence for that. But let's say it's a claim. It's a model. Then you say, okay, let's assume we have this thing called God and it can create universes. Sure. What type of universes would you expect from this? And how would you know? How would you test it? right? Well, how would what's the this starts getting at mechanisms, but even before mechanism, you can just say, what properties would a God have that would produce, like, how does that predict the overall entropy in the universe? How does it predict the expansion rate of the universe? How does it predict the ratio of hydrogen to helium in the universe, right? And of course they never make those kind of statements, right? They never make any concrete claims because they have no idea what the mechanism is like, and they have no idea even if not only that there's no supernatural, but that something what they label supernatural is able to act or cause or do anything. They haven't been able to demonstrate any of those things. And they're playing, I think, a little fast and loose with their vocabulary, translating from their everyday idea of cause and effect back to things which are timeless and spaceless and so on. I don't see how you can possibly expect that your notions of cause and effect are going to be valid when you're talking about something that's supposedly timeless and spaceless. And so, as Sean Carroll says, the theism is just not well defined, and it's for this reason. They don't make specific claims about these causes or supposed causes. They leave it somewhat nebulous and undefined. So,
yeah, fair enough. Matthew, you have been quiet.
I was enjoying listening. Honest, it's I don't mind admitting that that was starting to get a little bit out of my pay grade. There was a question I wanted to ask about, if you'll forgive me rewinding a little bit, about the cards example that you picked up regarding Bayes, and you're talking about, right. Bayes might be able to help you. Jump in and correct me if I'm understanding this wrong, but you said something about Bayes might be able to help you to give some kind of probability about what the first 5 or 10 cards might be if you had a deck of cards. If I had a magic power that could change the face of any card to be whatever it is I wanted it to be, does that disrupt what's going on to a point that it's not relevant even attempting to try to predict?
I mean, not really. I mean, you could make that claim. Like, for example, there was a guy over here named James Randi. For a long time, he had a challenge for anyone.
I'm familiar with the guy. Yeah,
who could present any kind of paranormal abilities or actions. And so something like what you just said, like, you could claim, I can change the card to anything I want to. And so you could come up with tests for that. And and all a test is just making us, because I said what Bayes' theorem says is that your belief in a claim or an explanation should scale with the how well your explanation fits the data, how likely that explanation is before you see the data. And in the case that you're talking about, the magic powers, that's going to have a pretty low prior because we've never seen it before. And then all of the plausible, but it has to be scaled down by all the plausible alternatives. Now, what in designing an experiment, designing a test, is you're trying to eliminate the alternatives. So all obvious alternatives are things like I'm going to cheat and swap out the deck somehow, right? So they control the deck, right? Or I can cheat with like mirrors or something like. I mean, you could imagine, and so you design an experiment to make all those alternatives really low probability. So that way, if you can demonstrate that you can, say, read off the first 10 cards ahead of time, and you do it and it kind of comes out correct, then you're going to believe your claim a lot more. But it comes down to also looking at the alternatives. And if you look and also being clear about what the data is. So in a controlled experiment, the point is to control the data in a sense, to really control for all the various alternatives. In a historical setting, you obviously can't do that, right? You can't go back in time and kind of rearrange things or test that. But because of that, we are going to be less certain of many claims. So if we said something like, Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, right? That's a common example that everyone brings up. We have evidence from basically every line, including the person's own writings, that this happened. But even there, we would probably be less confident in that than someone crossing, evidence for someone crossing the street today that I happen to see or something, right? Like, because that data is a lot more accessible. So because the data is less accessible, your uncertainty should be higher for whatever reason. So That's why I find it useful to imagine, like, if you took the same data, just made it more accessible, what that should do in any case is it should increase your probabilities that it's happened if it's actually true. So if you were to take something and you believe it at 50%, but it's been like 200 years, but you translated that data to this week and you're able to really look at it, and that same data would make you much more confident this week, then that's one thing. But if you take the claims about the resurrection and you translate them to modern day, no one buys it. Like, no one. And so that's one of those indications that somehow the data just really isn't up to holding the claims that people are making for it, and that there are a lot of other alternatives that if you had access to the situation, you would control for those. You would make sure that, like, the person wasn't lying, that you actually got independent interviews from different people, and so on, to avoid this sorts of things. That basically the same things we do in courts now to kind of get at the bottom of a story. The same thing, if you could do it in the past, but since you can't, your uncertainty is obviously going to be much higher.
Right.
Okay, so
graves go empty.
Right.
The empty tomb is not particularly surprising, right? The fact that someone might be seen after death could more easily be explained by a look.
Right. Even you said, like, the tomb being empty, it's easy to explain because tombs go empty. It's even better than that. Claims that the tomb was empty could easily be done. I mean, so
sure.
If someone had a vision and then later on, and that's all it was. Let's imagine that the entire Jesus story started off with a vision. It doesn't even have to be that, but let's imagine it was. Then what you would expect is that the empty tomb might be added as a later embellishment to the story because someone would have brought it up or something like that, right? And what you would, and then you would see it basically in later developments, but not in earlier ones. And that's exactly what you see. I mean, basically, Paul never mentions the empty tomb at all. But it's mentioned basically a little bit in Mark, and obviously the Matthew adds on the guards and all this other stuff. So you see that kind of progression. You see exactly the same thing in UFO sightings. You see the original claims might be pretty mundane, and then the story kind of gets embellished over time.
Right.
And so, but the whole thing could be a literary construction. I mean, that's an alternative. And even if you were thinking that's really rare, it's still more common than a miracle.
Right. And while we haven't talked about this, and I don't know if we have, and I don't know if we have time in deference to our agreement before the show started, but there should be a real question in all of the listeners' minds, I think, about how an account of history, no matter how sturdy it is, right? There should be a real question about how an account of history can ever confirm a miracle.
Because, yes, I don't think it could.
Right, because they are not fundamentally of the same stuff. History grapples with the world that we know, with the things that we can observe, the things that we as humans can do, right? It's human history. And a miracle is fundamentally something else. It's not something reportable by history because it's not repeatable by humans.
Well, actually, I think you might. So for example, even if you don't call it a miracle, even if you don't know whether it has a supernatural cause or anything else, just the idea, like, is there even a story there? And again, I go back to looking at UFO claims or even, let's say, faith healings. Those are actually pretty easy to come by in modern day. So you get these claims of people who've been miraculously healed. You could actually investigate whether they actually were healed of something, right? Even if you don't know the mechanism, even if you don't know if it's a miracle or any of that, right? You could even see, like, is there even a story there? And what I have found in looking at miracle claims kind of across the board is whenever you either get the one of two things: either you can show that no miraculous thing happened, just like nothing amazing happened to the person, right? like it could be somewhat mundane, like they talk about why doesn't God heal amputees. That would be something you could show, right? This person had an arm or didn't have an arm and then had an arm, and that would be something that you could demonstrate, and it could be a miracle, and you could demonstrate it even if you don't know the cause of it, without going to supernatural or anything else. Maybe there's some other alien technology or whatever that's an explanation. You don't need the explanation to show that the event actually happened. But if you're going to show that something, rather call it a miracle, something really amazing happened, you need to have really good evidence for it, because there's too many alternatives when you have something like that. So if you had for example, a report from 300 years ago about someone growing an arm back, you'd probably be like, no, I really don't believe it, because you may not even be able to ever have historical evidence that would satisfy someone for something like an arm growing back, even if you don't bring in the topic of miracles, because there are too many other alternatives. There's too many ways that the testimony could be wrong or incorrect or misleading or whatever it is.
Right. And so I think somewhere in there is my fundamental objection that even if we say that something unusual happened, and so let's start at the low end of the scale, and we have some event that is unusual, right? Maybe we don't call it a miracle. Maybe it's an unexpected cancer remission, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yes.
those are unusual, but not unheard of. We don't necessarily think of those as miracles. At least I don't think any of the three of us would. Right? And maybe we can't explain it, right? But it's minor enough that we're willing to grant that it happens within the laws of nature, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then we can graduate from that to something less explicable, like a regrown limb.
Mm-hmm.
We'd all question that, right? And
mm-hmm.
maybe we realize that there's some stem cell regeneration therapy that we didn't know about, and they regenerate an arm. I don't think that's currently the offing, but maybe in the future.
Right.
Then we get to something like a resurrection, and maybe we've got similar evidence, but at some point we get to a place where it's unexplained, and to reach beyond that line where we say, hey, this event is truly unexplained, to reach beyond that line and lay it at the feet of a supernatural agent.
Right.
That, to me, is where I'm complaining.
Right. Yeah. To go from I don't know what this causes this to I know what causes this and it's supernatural, that obviously is a move that we can't make rationally, because it's not well defined and so on. But I think we can't even get to the point with the resurrection that where we say this, we can even reasonably believe that these events happened as stated in these stories. The same way that I would question someone regrowing a limb, even from like 10 years ago.
Right.
And I would expect, but on the other hand, I'm not being overly skeptical in the sense that I could imagine evidence that would convince me of someone having regrown a limb. That would totally satisfy me. But you never see anything even remotely like that. And I don't think that level of evidence is even possible in history. So I think there is a limit to the types of events that one can demonstrate historically and have someone rationally believe they're probable. And I don't think they include things like limbs growing back or resurrections or those sorts of things. I just don't think that the type of evidence, even the best historical evidence, because we don't have access to it and there's just no way to demonstrate that these types of events are probable. And you don't even need to bring in miracles there. You can just say this is an unusual event, and there's a level of unusualness that you just cannot demonstrate historically.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because even if we leave aside miracles, one of our best tools for exploration is reproducibility. And to make claims about an event that we can't reproduce, or like some limb growing back, but we don't have to pick something that exotic.
Mm-hmm.
As time goes on and as events move further and further into the past, we are more skeptical of them. And in science, certainly, when some researcher makes a claim that is not reproducible, right, we're necessarily skeptical until it's either reproduced or ruled out.
Right.
And so in that way, we don't have to bring in miracles. We sort of do this in our everyday life, right? And so the question then would be, why would we grant the idea of miracles, some benefit that we don't otherwise use in our daily lives to assess the things?
Yep.
So we are rapidly moving toward a close, and
yes.
I wonder, Brian, first, do you have? We've worked through a lot of issues, right? We worked through cosmology, we worked through tuning, we worked through the Second Law of Thermodynamics, we've worked through history, resurrection, and we've been in a lot of places on this podcast. And I wonder if you've got some closing thoughts about Justin's book or about the show, like to give us that sort of puts a bow on this.
Well, I mean, pretty much everything that I do, I try to teach and show how to think properly, and thinking properly is pretty much the same as thinking skeptically, and to not take things at face value, and to really use your imagination to come up with alternatives, and not just be handed the first thing that you're given. And that's true for all these sorts of arguments. I mean, I like the Unbelievable show because it's a debate show, and you often get multiple sides of things, so you can investigate them possibly yourself. I mean, there've been a couple shows about miracles, for instance, and where they've made claims, and I've tried to track down those miracles, and where I have, they've either been mundane or the data is not available, and those are the only two options, which of course you wouldn't think of if these things were actually happening. And so I think there's almost a complacency in the way that a lot of Christians think, that when they're handed an explanation like, oh, there's order in the universe and therefore there must be an agent, they don't really think through, like, what are the consequences of that? And does that really explain anything? Or is it just comfortable in that way? I think they kind of stop short of alternatives, are convinced that I think the things that confuse me the most sometimes are being convinced by this historical evidence that on every way that you look at it seems to be lacking. But I'd like to just kind of repeat that message of just like thinking skeptically, look at every side of things, and constantly question.
Very good, Matthew. What about you?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that have popped to my mind, and hopefully they won't get us distracted for another 20 minutes. But picking up on Brian's answer to my question about Bayes, I like the point about reducing the probability of the other explanations. So I think if we're thinking about something that sounds or that is special or implausible or done by either someone who's magic or someone who's God, have we really adequately removed all of the other possibilities? Because often there are a lot of possibilities that we could have. And I think the thing about the Gospels, and I make this point occasionally when I'm having a discussion, is the Gospels could have evolved into what they are, and they might have been something very different at the very beginning, or the stories that ended up in the Gospels might have had a longer history than we think, and they might have ended up in the Gospels as an end point as in an evolved narrative. Can we really be sure that isn't what actually happened? And I think sometimes not enough credence is given to those examples, and I think not enough effort is done to remove those, which leads me on to a story here. And this is a little bit of a spoiler, because there is a future episode of Roundtable Skeptics and Seekers and Ask an Atheist anything which might include this story. That's certainly my plan. But I have a family member who 40 years ago was involved in a kidnap scenario. It wasn't pleasant for that individual. They were kidnapped in the morning. They were released towards the end of that day. It was quite a horrific experience. But the bit that's critical is at this person's funeral 30 years later, somebody, a minister, it was in a church, this person had been a Christian all of their lives, and somebody stood up in the church and was talking about this person's life. And the minister that was giving the talk had never met the individual concerned, but the minister had been talking to somebody who had known that person for 20 years. So had known, the story was coming from somebody who had known my family member after the event. And I think that's quite critical. And so the story that was told about this family member that had been kidnapped was that the release of the release of the person that had been kidnapped, I'm being intentionally vague, so please forgive me for being intentionally vague about who it is. The person who had been kidnapped, the story that was told at their funeral was that there'd been people, the church got together and they prayed, and after the church had prayed, there'd been a thunderstorm and a strike of lightning, and that had invoked fear into the people who'd done the kidnapping, and the person had been released. That version of the story that was told at this person's funeral was the first time that I had heard that version of the story. And if you bear in mind that I had known about this story the entirety of my life, this story had been told in my presence since the months after it had ever happened. And the first time I ever heard about this miraculous thunderstorm with the miraculous strike of lightning, with the miraculous fear into the people that kidnapped the person to suddenly let them free. The first time that came in was at the funeral, and it had never been told until that point. There is a perfect example of, in a single lifetime, miraculous events can be imagined by people, because a story is told and is traveled from one person to another, somebody who was never there at the very beginning, and suddenly the story 30 years later is very different to the reality of what actually happened.
Matthew, I have a question on that. Did you, in terms of when you heard that story, did you choose to tell everyone around that didn't happen, and that you were really shutting down that particular story, or no?
No, I didn't. It was a funeral. Yeah, it was a funeral, and it was in a church. And
do you know why I asked that?
Yes, I can guess why you asked that. Yes,
because a common response about the New Testament stories is that, the Jews at the time who could have produced a body, they never said anything about against the story, and so on, and they would have known.
That's an inspired question, Brian. Thank you for asking that question. No, I didn't. And there is somewhere in this country, there is a church which believed very strongly that a glorious miracle happened, which never happened. What I did do, though, in that event was, at that funeral, there was another close family member. And I went to that family member and I said, that story wasn't right. And that family member said, well, it might be right. There is a written record that the family member wrote after the kidnapping event, which includes this miracle. Maybe you should go and try that. So what I did was I went through all the boxes of stuff, clearing out the house, finding up, and I found the account of the kidnapping. It was written 10 years after the kidnapping, so 20 years before the funeral, around about the time that the new story happened. And so I found this thing, and I thought, fabulous, I'm going to find a story about the lightning strike. And I read it. There was no mention of the lightning strike in that story.
Wow, that's good. That's a great example.
So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah. So in closing, I think I want to say that there's an important lesson about skepticism, Brian, that you brought up, that I think is instructive about how honest we should be as skeptics. So I tend these days to be perhaps more dismissive of some accounts than I should be. You talked about comparing the resurrection to alien abduction, and that there could at least be some cases where without understanding the cause, we could identify that some event actually did take place, right? And I think that's an important lesson in skepticism, to not sort of throw the baby out with bathwater, right? To be honest about Christian claims, to assess them individually, right? To look at what the actual evidence is. Some of it's 2,000 years old, right? It's not that we can't make good assessments. Maybe good is the wrong word. We can make probabilistic assessments, right? And be as good judges as we can of the things that we're told. And so it's possible that toward the end here in our conversation, I was more dismissive than I should have been, and so I think that was a good lesson in skepticism. And thank you. And I thank you for coming on, talking to largely lay people about science and the second law of thermodynamics. I hope that the task was not too arduous.
Oh, it's been fun.
And so thank you to the listeners. I will include the Sean Carroll William Lane Craig debate in the show notes. I will include Brian's blog, Brian blogs at bblaze.github.io, if I'm not mistaken. And we will include other resources that go along with this show in the show notes. If you'd like to reach out and get in touch with us, you certainly are welcome to do that, to agree or disagree, or just say hello. We'll be happy to pass your comments on if they need to be. The place to get in touch with us is stillunbelievablepodcast@gmail.com. So that's stillunbelievablepodcast@gmail.com. And we thank you for listening to this episode of Still Unbelievable.